Oh, yeah, beautiful. Great. So, so the invitation today, I'm going to get out of gallery view. The invitation today is to put your hand up by putting it up in the chat. You can ask either of us questions in the chat and participate and be in a conversation. I'll stop our conversation with enough time to really get into Q&A with Ari, and we want it to be in flow. It's a really big time in the world. Everybody's feeling a lot of feelings, and I think it's really relevant. Well, first I'll say hi to my friend. Hi, Ari.
Hi Barry, and hi everyone. So good to be with all of you and see faces who carry a sense of beauty and connection from when I was privileged to be with you in person.
And where are you? Where are we calling into?
I'm in Los Angeles right now.
A big charge in the US at the moment. We wanted to mention, talk about, reflect on the election today from the lens of connection, empathy, the shadow. There's so much to talk about. And you and I were just saying, Van had to stop us because we were just rolling straight in. So for those of us who are not used to Small Giants Academy, we go in deep. So we're going straight in, peeps. Gear up. It's 8 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. I didn't even know what day it was. I'm in liminal time. But Ari and I straight away were talking about all the things that the election has kind of evoked in the collective consciousness, in the individual consciousness, how different people are experiencing it. And, for me, I have been really watching this election with a very different personal tone, personal feeling. And I want to acknowledge that there are a lot of people on this call. There are some people who might be thrilled with the outcome of the election. And there will be other people on this call who are devastated and really holding a lot of grief and sorrow. And it feels like it's an incredibly consequential election in the culture. These last 8 years have been, and now we're looking at another 8 years in front of us, and different people. I guess the question is, Ari, we all want to know what's moving in you because you're there and you are an American and it's more proximate for you, where in the after effects, the rest of the world is impacted by the American election, but it's not about the politics, right? It's about the people, it's about the culture, it's about how we find each other, it's about the other and language and all of these juicy things that make the human cohort on Earth. So maybe share a little bit of the joy and all the things that are moving in you in this moment, in this very big moment.
Yeah, there's so much. I start with the kind of radical curiosity, which is what has come up for me around the election and being in contact with people on, I don't want to say both sides because I don't
No,
think it's not binary,
no.
but all the sides of discourse around the election, the process, American politics, um, perspectives that seem to be contradictory about the future of democracy and democratic processes, about the state of our most vulnerable populations. Um, but for me, the broadest set of questions and the most important ones really go to the root of how do we live together across these kinds of really consequential differences. So I felt an upwelling of curiosity, which I'm leaning into and trying to share with some of my students and fellows and others, because I think we don't know yet some very fundamental things about what it means to live with otherness. And I'm thinking about my teacher, Professor Wiesel, who often said it is the otherness of the other which fascinates me, meaning it's precisely the place where I'm in the presence of someone who has a view that I find to be offensive or problematic or crazy, that I can grow and I can learn. It's important to say that there are limits to this. So, as I often say, he never debated a Holocaust denier in public. He didn't want to dignify that perspective with even with a debate, certainly not with a dialogue. There are limits, and there are bad actors who are not interested in dialogue and who have an agenda that's manipulative and cynical and want to maybe hijack our openness sometimes. But there are a lot of people who are well-intentioned, sincere people, and they might see things in polar opposite ways. So how do we live with that otherness of the other? And there are several things that come up there. aside from curiosity. One is the techniques for building spaces for those kinds of conversations, which is part of what's broken down in American politics and certainly in other places in the world as well. How do we build vessels for those difficult conversations? And in the metaphor in my tradition, in the Jewish tradition, there's always light that we're receiving or sharing or giving. But in order to receive or share or give light, we need vessels to hold the light because the light by itself is too powerful, too protean, too fluid. And so just like if you want to drink a cup of tea, you need the cup, or else you've got a wet pair of pants and you're thirsty, right? So how do we build vessels for these conversations? And the harder the conversation, the more powerful the vessel needs to be, the more intentional it needs to be. That's one piece that we're thinking about a lot and working on. And the other is, and I'm drawing here on, again, on Jewish tradition, we've got two primary modes in classical Jewish thought. And I think we have two modes in contemporary politics, certainly in the US, but I think elsewhere. And the modes are a kind of legalistic policy mode where we have to figure out what to do. Are we voting yes or no on ballot question number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4? And it's a binary choice. Are we voting for Trump or Harris? It's a binary choice. I mean, there are other candidates, but that's the primary binary choice. And did you know there were other candidates on the ballot, by the way? A
Yeah,
lot of
yeah,
people,
yeah.
a lot of people didn't know that when
Yeah, yeah.
I've spoken to another country.
There were some epic ones. It was like Lord of the Rings or whatever. It's so good because there were like conspiracy theorists and
Yeah,
like countercultural radical nut jobs, and you were just like, how's this gonna go? This is so exciting, but not but terrifying. Yeah,
it is terrifying.
yeah,
It was intense to be in the
yeah,
in the voting station actually voting. It was really
yeah.
intense
Wow.
for those reasons and more. And so, I think the binary modality is real and has a place. There are times we have to vote yes or no. We have to choose A or B. Those are really important. When you product test, you do A/B testing. You want to know which one is better. And when you vote for the highest office in the US, you want to know we have to determine these things as a community. That's the way democracy works. But there's another mode which is really all about storytelling. And in the storytelling mode, we really find that one story doesn't contradict another story. You never would say that, Mark Twain's story contradicts Mary Shelley's story. You wouldn't sort of think in those terms because stories coexist and they illuminate different things. They might be complementary, they might point in different directions, but they're not in competition in that same closed binary system way. And so I think a lot about the politics of, in Jewish terms, of halacha, which is law or the way we walk in the world, which is where we need to determine what to do, the politics of policy, which is a little clunky way to say it, or the politics of storytelling. And we know that behind every policy, there's a story. Behind every story, there's a person and a set of experiences. There have been some good attempts in this country to ask questions about those stories, try to get to know each other beyond the policy. But it's such a marginal thing right now, and it's so sort of frowned upon and seen as incidental or irrelevant to American politics, where we
Which is
prefer.
which is so crazy because of course our stories are our sense of belonging.
Right.
Our belonging to ourselves, our belonging to each other and a group and a tribe and a way of speaking and a way of being.
And
Our
the future we
stories
imagine,
and the
yeah.
future we imagine and the present we experience, our stories and belonging is exactly what happened in this election.
Right.
It was very much an election about belonging
And about stories.
and about story.
But the kind of the technology of storytelling, I think, has been compromised. It's been often hijacked in the service of and a manipulative agenda. So when I talk about storytelling, I'm not talking about a politician telling you a story that was created by committee to demonstrate the folksy relatability of the politician. That's not the real kind of sacred storytelling I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of the kind of storytelling that some of us experience together at the forum, where we're really digging deep and sharing a story that goes beyond an agenda.
Yeah.
Stories carry messages, but they're not defined by an agenda. They're really open and help us humanize each other, help us see each other and empathize, and sometimes be wounded and heartbroken into a new understanding of the other in a way that's not fundamentally competitive. So, what are the dynamics of the ways in which we've been industrialized in modernity? How have we been sort of taken over by these ideas that we need to produce outcomes and policy outcomes, and that's all we're for, that's all we're designed for, and that is the sum total of our political life. It's to produce the right policies or the right set of policies, as opposed to a politics that makes room for both the policy level and the story humanizing level, which I think both are critical. One of them is really endangered right now, I think.
So, excuse me, everyone, for this cough. This is like the forever cough. It's gross, but anyway, it just is. I love that being wounded into a new understanding. I think that's kind of talking to this emergence conversation that you and I have been having. But if we just hold back, I'm just going to ask you one question before we talk about emergence and possibilities, because that's your and my nature. We're like leaning into the mythopoetic, the possibilities, the emergent, like that's the juicy space. What does this open up? What does this mean for us on this living planet? But if we go back to where stories and politics intersect and all of this feels existential. Like, I think one of the reasons that we created politics was in the paradigm of competition, one of our stories needs to win. And right now, around the world, human beings are feeling that their story needs to be heard and centered because it's existential.
Mm-hmm.
What do we do with the temperature gauge on all of our essentializing? My story over your story, my victimhood over your victimhood, my history over your history. Like, it really is a battle of narratives. And I didn't grow up in that world. It was more pluralist. It was, it was a different world. We all know that. And it felt like I grew up in a time where I touched a space of the possibility for all of these stories to exist in a mashup of, a symphonic orchestra of humanity that was like really awesome. You could tap in and listen to this one and that one, but none of it wasn't existential, certainly not from my lens. So what happens when the temperature's so high up because of these political frame dynamics that make us think our stories are existential?
Well, first of all, it could very well be existential
Yeah.
for many people and for many of us, and the stakes are indeed very high, both in terms of international issues and climate and war and conflict and the level of weaponry we have that makes all of that super high stakes. And in local politics as well, people's immediate needs are either being met or not being met. These are real consequential things, and some of them are existential. There's a lot of real urgency. And I don't think we need to deny that in order to also be able to say we can, as a practice, as a fruitful practice, we can create spaces of letting go of that urgency and opening up a space of not knowing, for example. Or I have my policies and my political convictions, and I spend a lot of time working to defend them, to advance them, to persuade people of them. And that's really important. That's what we call activism and leadership. But can we create spaces for learning and for slowing down and for opening up and bracketing what we know and what we believe firmly and passionately in order to be able to connect and consider new possibilities? And this is one of the things when I reflect on Professor Wiesel's life and work, one of the things that's a mystery to me to this day is how he inhabited two very different spaces at once. And one of them is hardcore activism, quick, clear, making ethical determinations about things in the world, going public with those within 24 to 36 hours of things happening in the world. Sudan, Darfur in the early 2000s, and he was the first to call it a genocide and to advocate for that with great difficulty in the US, State Department, at the UN. And that was a very clear position. He put an op-ed in the New York Times before anyone else saying this is a genocide, it's not a civil war. We have to take a position. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the oppressed. He did that a lot. He also created spaces in his classroom, which is where I spent time with him, and in conferences where people could get together and entertain all kinds of questions in a deeply pluralistic and open space where there wasn't necessarily a right answer. And because of those spaces, dialogue was possible between enemies, between people who had never spoken to each other before, like the Israeli prime minister and the head of the Palestinian Authority, Olmert and Abbas. Their first contact was at a conference that Elie Wiesel hosted.
Oh, wow.
And it was offline, and it was sort of a safe space. There were no journalists or anyone else allowed. It was a very private space, well-designed space, and they were able to have a conversation. Same thing happened with Nelson Mandela and a member of the de Klerk government, the apartheid government in South Africa. Their first contact was at a conference hosted by Elie Wiesel, and it was because he designed it for that without that kind of urgency. So can we have spaces for urgency and spaces for openness? And it feels artificial to shift from one to the other, but I think we have to do both. We do need the urgency, we need activism. I want activists who are fighting for things that I think are wrong to continue their activism because that's authentic to them. But I also really want them to spend 5%, 10%, 20% of their time and mental, spiritual energy opening up and saying, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's another way of looking at this. Maybe there's something I'm missing fundamentally. Maybe my sources of information are wrong or distorted. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And if we don't have that percentage of openness and curiosity, we can end up fighting with great passion and great moral conviction and courage on the wrong side of history. And it's happened many times before. So I think we have to be careful about that. I don't want people to freeze or be paralyzed, but I think we need spaces for learning and questioning too. How do we structure all of that is a big question I'm sitting with these days.
And it goes back to this other really big thing that I think lots of people are holding, which is, I loved how you said that we need vessels to hold the light. And the way that I understand and interpret that is everyone on this call can cultivate themselves as a vessel to hold the light. Sometimes dimmer, sometimes brighter, but what does it mean to cultivate oneself and one's sort of social landscape as a vessel to hold light? So just for a minute, cultivating that 10%, what does that look like?
First of all, I think it's up to leaders and teachers and storytellers and artists to really think about how are we designing spaces or experiences for people to do that. What kind of language are we using? So if I offer a seminar, for example, on reflections on the election, people will make all kinds of assumptions about what that is, right? In the US, certainly. We're going to talk about grief and shock or elation or whatever they're going to impose and project their own position. If we think about alternative metaphors for this moment, and we draw on deep story work, and we think about, is this a moment of, I'm drawing on a storytelling tradition that I love, as some of you know, from Hasidic tales. Is this a moment of a princess being lost and we're searching for her? Or is this a moment of wondering, as I shared on the podcast, which direction do we go to get to the tree of joy and delight? And when a wise person comes and says, it's not about which direction to go, it's about who do you need to become to get to that tree of delight? What is that shift? Or is it about two birds that have been separated and they're the last of their species, which means if they don't come together again, their species is going extinct, and they're wailing and crying because they're separated? And how do we bring them back together? Those are images from myths, from stories that can open up different kinds of processes and experiences of talking about this moment in our political life. It's a decidedly non-political language.
Yeah.
That can be avoidant, because I do want to bring it back to, okay,
Yeah.
what's the policy that we need? What do we do about immigrants in this country? What do we do about border security and immigrant rights? And no human being is illegal, as Professor Wiesel said, and all of those things. Those are really important conversations among many others that we need to have. But we are better equipped to have those conversations if we have first enriched the room or the community with those deeper kinds of language. And it just evokes things in us that we need to have effective political conversation. Things like curiosity, a sense of mystery and wonder and humility in the presence of the limits of what we actually know. Um, and if you put all of that together with a good knowledge of political history, U.S. politics, et cetera, and you have people in the room who have deep knowledge of policy questions, I've seen some remarkable things happen.
Yeah, you and I were talking about it the other day, but it feels like we're at a time in the world where there is almost nothing as powerful as a regulated person in a dysregulated room.
Mm.
And that, I loved, and I almost want to like put it up on my wall, but I know it to be true. It's just ringing very true for me at the moment, which is, I think this is something Professor Wiesel said. Yes, it is, from your amazing book. If you guys haven't gotten Ari's book, Witness, it's really, really special. I've ear tagged every second page, so you should get it. It's a lot of these lessons from Professor Wiesel and Ari's life's journey, but this sentence I've just been thinking about and kind of quoting every day: superficiality is the enemy of everything. And that feels incredibly countercultural to say that in this moment. But how do you become a regulated person in every dysregulated room? It's leaning into the depth and the richness of one's own humanity and the humanity, being curious about the otherness of the other and getting back to curiosity. And I think what happened was that the public landscape and even the interpersonal landscape had become compressed into this narrow, oxygenless space where we couldn't be curious. We couldn't say the really awkward human things to each other because there had become unbelievably rigid rules for how we interact.
Mm-hmm.
And our humanity was taken out of the space between us, and we need to reinfuse it into ourselves and between each other.
That's a really important point. I think we've become, a lot of the discourse has become humorless and
Yes,
impermissive and dogmatic, almost in a religious sense. There's a kind of
yes.
fanaticism that you find in earlier in history and religious movements, and now it's in politics. And one of the things on a
It's
very,
not just in politics, but it's in the space between us in everyday life now.
yeah, that's right. That's right. And one of the things I think is that happens is when you start with the person and not the position, things can happen. One of our fellows told us a story about uh, she was organizing and involved in anti-racism protests in Atlanta, Georgia, in the U.S. Um, several years ago, and she was she was trying to bring the protesters and the police and National Guard together in human connection, even while they were on opposite sides of these protests, um, at least in terms of their positioning.
Yeah.
The police were there to contain protesters. The National Guard were called in to contain the protesters and limit their access to certain places like City Hall and state capitals. And she would bring a boombox down to the protests every day, play dance music, and she got the National Guard and the protesters to dance together. And it was in the news for that. It was, a really humanizing moment. Some of the National Guard individuals said, not as a group, but individual people said, we actually agree with you on a lot of this,
Yeah.
and we have to do our job. So that was happening, but she had a boombox that had to be plugged in. It wasn't like battery run, and so she would drive down with her equipment, and she had to plug in with a long extension cord to some sort of source of power. And great metaphor, but literal electricity. She couldn't find a spot. And finally, there was a construction site. She found a place. She asked, "Can I plug in here?" And there was a construction worker who helped her every day from that point on to set up, to plug in, set up, make sure she had power to do this beautiful sacred work of getting people to dance in this moment of great intensity. And then she spoke to him a little bit greater length after a while and discovered he's a Trump supporter. They disagree about everything. And she was able to hold it and have a deep connection with him and conversation with him because they had already encountered each other as human beings and they'd found points of connections. So the order really matters. And I think one of the things we do is we replace the other with a caricature or a mask. We limit them and reduce them to a position instead of recognizing, as we know from all of our wisdom traditions, that every human being is a world and is worthy of dignity and reverence and is a mystery. And I want to know all about you. Tell me why. Tell me how you got here. What experiences led you to this position? I don't care what side you're on. And I know it's very high stakes and people feel like the policy is life threatening to many of our most vulnerable, or life threatening in another way in terms of international dynamics and war and conflict and American power. The stakes are extremely high. That's not an excuse for letting go of that search for the humanity of the other and the reality that we are actually mysteries to each other. And if we don't start to ask those questions with reverence and curiosity, we miss it. We miss opportunities and we sink into those rigidities.
And it also feels like, I feel just in watching the reflections from the election online and the brief amount of time that I am online nowadays, because I prefer to be in the garden or in beloved discourse with people. But it just feels like people are walking into war. Like no one wants war, no one wants conflict, but everyone's walking into it with like just in our ways of being, and
we're rewarding it. I mean, this is like the way we're set up now. You know, extreme political positions get 6 times the coverage in the news than moderate positions, and that's just built in now. That's built into and baked into how we receive information and what gets privileged. And I think we also have at least in the U.S., I don't know if it's true in Australia or elsewhere, but it probably is to some extent. You can tell me we have this kind of heroic ideal of the gladiator and the gladiatorial kind of ethos of like we are going to fight and we are going to win is increasingly becoming centered and dominant. And so one of the things we have to think about is what's the role of a sacred counterculture that says curiosity is heroic, or forget about heroism, or we have to humanize in a not in a soft way. And great nonviolent leaders or leaders of and teachers of nonviolence have spoken about this for a long time. MLK spoke about this a lot. The power of soft power, the ferocity of nonviolence, the ways in which it's a use of power, but it's a use of power with intentionality and with humanity. But we don't hear that. It's not what we see. It's not what's modeled for us or for our children. I think that's part of the problem.
I just want to talk for like another few hours about the role of the sacred, the sacred counterculture. I want to go straight there. Before that, just want to invite everyone who's listening, please, if you have questions or you want to engage in the conversation, we know you're there and we're having the conversation on your behalf with you. Please ask questions in the chat and you can chat to Ariel because we've got a little bit of time left. But maybe, Ari, we could talk about the shadow, because you've been thinking a lot about the joy and heartbreak and the shadow and emergence. What are you thinking about those things? What's evoking for you right now? Because you seem good. You seem really good. It was worse in the anticipatory landscape to the election, wasn't it? There's something different that's emerged.
Yeah, I have moments too. And, there are moments of deep, not just about the election, about the state of the world. There are moments, but curiosity is very helpful. Curiosity is like a pair of wings for me. It just really lifts me up when I can dive into that series of questions. And there's that great T.H. White quote that my friend and teacher Parker Palmer loves, which is, I don't remember the whole quote, but it's learning is the thing for you. When the world gets you down, this is from the Once and Future King. It's Merlin speaking to a young Arthur. When the world gets you down and people seem, I'm really paraphrasing, when people seem shitty, you just have to dive into learning. And that curiosity can really lift us up. So that's helping. I do think it's dark, and I do think there's a lot that's real about the shadow right now. And I talk a lot about joy because I have a very fierce commitment to cultivating joy, and that comes from my tradition. It comes from the teachings and the path I've been following for the last 25 or 30 years, which is the Hasidic tradition in Judaism, Jewish mystical teachings, which is all about joy, not as an avoidance or even for its own sake, but joy because it is the engine of passionate hard work. And the more joyful we are, the more we are able to stay in there when things are really tough. Joy and resilience are closely connected. Gratitude and resilience are closely connected. And it becomes a responsibility to cultivate joy and a kind of resistance to cultivate joy. But I'm aware that it's really banal and it is superficial to jump to joy, to go straight to joy without acknowledging the shadow and the darkness. And I think about something Professor Wiesel taught already in the early 90s. He gave a talk where he said, I wrote my first book, Night, which is his memoir about the Holocaust, in order to create a cage for the reader, a prison, in order to give the reader the experience of the prison in which I lived, and the way in which time itself became a prison for us during the Holocaust. And I wrote all the other books. He wrote about 40 other books. He said, I wrote the other books in order to break open the prison. And so the big question is, why did he have to write the prison first before opening the cage, opening the doors of the prison? If he's going to get us there anyway, why do you need that? Why do you need the descent into slavery and then freedom in the Exodus story? Why do you need the darkness before the light? Why is the world created with darkness and then light? Um, these are the kinds of things that are discussed a lot in our mystical tradition. But one of the things it does is when you go to the edge of despair, and it means you're taking the world seriously, and you're taking suffering seriously, and you're taking the stakes and what's at stake very seriously, and with urgency and with a real sense of commitment and sensitivity and responsibility. And I think that is critically important. If you stay there, if you stay in that edge of the abyss and you fall into the abyss, you're not going to really help anyone, because you're going to be spending a lot of time on Netflix just avoiding the world, which is natural. If it's happening to you, you don't have to feel bad about it. But at some point you want to get out from under the covers and go do something to help. And so there's this journey through darkness, and you don't know for sure if you're going to get out the other side. And it doesn't happen just once. It happens over and over again as we confront the world, maybe as we read the news. And we have to really pay attention to how are we navigating these things and finding the capacity to keep going, and even to dig deep for joy without denying or minimizing the darkness. That's one of the challenges we have right now, because so many of us, politicians included, are holding us to the light and pretending there's no darkness, or projecting all the darkness to the other side of the political equation. And we know that that's just unrealistic and not helpful. But a lot of people are falling into despair. A lot of young people, especially, are falling into despair right now. Anxiety, depression. And they talk about, sometimes with humor, which is helpful, that we are living in an apocalyptic time. I think apocalyptic thinking is actually useful right now, because we remember apocalypse means revelation in the original Greek. So we're living in an apocalyptic time where things are going to be revealed, and we have to start asking what's emerging, what's creeping up on us from the edges of our vision, what's breaching the surface from underneath and showing its face to us. It might be ugly, it might be hard, but it's a revelation that we need to pay attention to.
One of my friends wrote this amazing book, Ari, I've got to send it to you. He had an amazing online media company called Rebel Wisdom, and he's written a book about using he was in a psychedelic experiment, and he's a really thoughtful guy. He's done a lot of personal work, so he wasn't new to it, but to use plant medicine and psychedelics as a metaphor for this time. He sort of said, he went in with questions about the system itself and about the future and about emergence. And the book is brilliant because it compares the psychedelic experience to exactly what we're going through now, and all that becomes evoked, the archetypes, the mythos, the story, the reflections, the shadow, the real confrontation and merging with things that have been marginalized. And so the world gets turned upside down for the purpose of, almost in a shamanistic way, we come back with the essential oil, some new kind of knowing, and we bring that back into the world as a healing, and that it should be a healing portal.
And the shaman, in almost every tradition that I know, the shaman becomes really sick or close to death, or has some sort of experience of deep wounding in order to be somehow opened up to that new knowledge that can help, or the new technology that can help people. And in our time, we expect people to get there without that wounding, or without that near-death experience. Like great innovators in technology they're just serial startup people, right? So they come across a great idea and they create the next tech which is going to change our life in some way. Where is that? And sometimes if you dig deep, you find there are actually wounds, but it's not the story we tell about our heroes and heroines now. We're telling stories about darkness free shamanism, and that's really dangerous, or fake. So we have a lot of fake shamanism now, we have to be willing to do that. But I say that as if it's casual. It's really a question of how do we hold each other, support each other, particularly in small groups and communities, to have the sustenance, the nurturing, the support, the checks and balances, the accountability to do that really hard work. And so it's a very personal thing, but I think it does emerge in a real way into collective patterns.
Ari, yes, we could keep talking, but I think we might turn to some of those beautiful questions in the chat. Please put more in there if you want, because I would love it if you would directly ask Ari your questions. I think we would go, Kathy, that's a great question. Do you feel like asking Ari your question yourself? Rabbi
I'd
Bernie.
love to ask that question. Hi, Ariel. It was wonderful
Hi.
to see you in Melbourne a little while ago. You mentioned a number of different metaphors and talked about the power of them, and I'm really curious what or which metaphors you turn to in this moment or you find helpful that you might be able to share.
Yep, thanks, Kathy. It's good to see you. It's a great question, and there are different ones that are going through my mind in different days of the week or hours of the day. But one of them is this verse. It's a verse in Psalms, and I'm finding that the Psalms themselves, the book of prayers of David and others, to be really an incredible kind of source of wisdom and resilience right now, because the Psalms are often about, there are a lot of things going on in the Psalms, but one of the things is about a kind of helplessness and a begging, being like a holy beggar, and recognizing that we don't have any capacity to figure out any of this stuff, and then moving through that in relationship with the divine, the transcendent, the intelligence behind all of this in some way. And so it's a very prayerful thing. But you also find a combative, kind of aggressive energy in the Psalms. And so it moves back and forth between these modes. One of the verses that it keeps echoing in my mind is, God is the shadow on your right side. Hashem tzilcha al yad yaminecha. God is the shadow to your right, like literally to your right side. And the idea of God being a shadow, there's a Hasidic teaching that says that means that God follows you, that just like a shadow follows you. Whatever you do with your hand, the shadow does the same thing. And so we in some way are shaping God's activity these days, maybe always, maybe in moments of crisis. And the use of the imagery of shadow I find really compelling. The imagery of the shadow is God, or God is in the shadow, or we don't have to be afraid of shadows. We have to actually turn into the shadow and be somehow in dialogue with it. So what are all the things that we don't want to see? What are all the things we're projecting on others who disagree with us to turn them into a shadow? And how do we relate to those with a sense of reverence, like we, in classical religious language, we relate to God? How do we bring that reverence, that sense of awe and openness and prayerfulness and a kind of sacred inadequacy, but also a kind of sacred chutzpah, radical commitment, like we are in charge here. God is following our lead in some way. That's one metaphor that I'm really staying with. The universe is following our lead. The world is following our lead. How do I take full responsibility for my life and my impact on other people and my moral footprint and where my clothes are made, and all the things we need to be thinking about? And also, how do we take responsibility for the way we talk about these issues and engage and create spaces for these issues, as opposed to waiting for someone to come and save us, which is a more traditional, maybe caricature of a religious view. We're messing it up, God is going to save us. Well, maybe God is waiting for us. Ani DiFranco said it really well in a song called "What If No One's Watching." And there's a line that says, what if God ain't looking down? What if he's looking up instead?
Beautiful, Ari. I love that. It just made me think of this walk I went on the other day. I went on a walk around a big park, and with this person who's close to me, and half of the walk they were just telling me their euphoria about Trump being, just like next level euphoria. Like, let's go. This is the best. Let's go. And I was able to, like, just personally hold the space with, I didn't have much of a feeling other than the being with, and I could feel myself, no projections, no, just a kind of listening and being with that person. And then the second half of the walk, we were able to like go deeper and talk about like personal things and relationships and like quite gnarly stuff. And it was beautiful. It was like the listen and the response. It had this kind of energetic to it that felt really weirdly nourishing, where all things could happen and projection was a lot less. There was connection instead of projection, which I felt personally victorious about. Anthony, can you ask your question?
Thanks, Barry. Thanks, Ariel. I just wanted to ask how you think about narratives that are deliberately divisive, that are deliberately trying to get a reaction from us, that are deliberately trying to separate people, which are becoming dominant because they have some power and some, there's some juice in them. So how do you think about relating to those?
Well, the first thing is, how do we know if they're deliberately divisive or if it's a story that I don't resonate with because it's coming from an angle of approach that isn't mine? There are really two dangers here, right? One is I can actually encounter something really bad or evil and explain it away or be sort of neutral and soft on it. And then I'm permissive and I'm allowing it and I'm actually participating in it and responsible for not intervening or preventing it. And the other one is I can encounter something which is not evil. It's just not mine. And I can call it evil and kind of marginalize it or shut it down in that way. Those are both real dangers. So the first part is that deep kind of questioning of motivation and what's behind the story. If the effect of the story is to dehumanize, one of the things that's really important is to recognize that if you're dehumanizing another person, you're dehumanizing me. You're not talking about someone else. You're talking about me. That is me, right? Even if we're talking about another group, if you're talking about another racial group or religious group or whatever, that sense of connection, of solidarity, gives me moral strength and commitment and responsibility to speak up in the same way that I hope that we speak up about attacks on our own communities. That identification is important. And one example I mentioned earlier is when the discourse around immigration years ago was about illegals. It's a language you hear a lot. Professor Wiesel said loud and clear, no human being is illegal. So I think first you have to consider the hard questions of what's the motivation, what is this functionally doing, and is this a deliberate and divisive story that someone is telling? But once you determine that it is, and it's possible to do so, you have to speak up loud and clear. You have to activate that power of ferocity and clarity and courage to speak up and tell a different story, or say sometimes you're lying. And it happens that people lie in our current world, in our current political discourse. And you have to be equipped to do that. So one of the things we have to do is also do our homework about data and stats and real background so that we are equipped to respond to things that are manipulations or lies. Unfortunately, we're seeing that a lot. That's why a lot of young people that I know are kind of giving up on political processes, because the epistemology is so messed up. Like we keep being lied to, so we're just going to forget the whole thing and become very self-involved and avoid any sort of activism or politics at all. That's a great danger here.
Yeah, and it's a great danger around the world. That's what the first forum was about, the sense making. Like, how do we lean into a collective sense making that is coherent because not only are we being fed lies, because of bad actors and bad agendas, but even in our own bubbles, we're being fed really fanatical kind of narratives. And that idea of how do you sense when, this moral landscape or the moral footprint that you were talking about, I love that language. Like, how do you sense that it's like these tools, these soft power tools are really elusive. Curiosity is actually an incredible strength. If you can have curiosity at a time like this and resilience and joy, these are really powerful technologies, human ways to counteract being turned into consumers, being turned into these kind of narrow, superficial vessels for narratives that drive us further away from each other. So I think that sense-making piece is quite hard, Ari, and the question is how to cultivate a real a capacity to hold many things to be true at the same time. And when you were talking before about the shadow and interacting with the shadow, I just had this strong Peter Pan imagery, that beautiful scene in the original cartoon where Peter just turns and he looks at his shadow and then he's dancing with his shadow and having this playful, joyful, wicked interaction with his own shadow. And I kind of wished that for all of us, maybe.
Barry, I was reading that this year, the original book by J.M. Barrie, and he loses his shadow. That's the beginning, right? And it needs to be, Wendy stitches it back on.
That's right.
So, and that's a classic, mythological trope. And one of the things I think that we're seeing is Professor Wiesel used to say, we send when people get old, our parents get old, we love them, but we send them away to Florida and we don't want to see them. And so, our fear of shadow, of whether it's mortality or other things, has made us vulnerable to manipulation. I want to go back for a moment and just say that, this forum of people asking questions and me answering or responding implies that I have answers, and I have some responses. I do, but there are also a lot of things I don't know these days. And I think that kind of, that's the thing I'm interested in, is the place of not knowing or unknowing, because that's a place where I think new discoveries, new emergent wisdom can really happen.
Yeah, the space of humility. Ellie, why don't you ask Ari your question?
Hi, Ariel. How are you?
Hey, Ellie.
Good to see you. How do you navigate that place of unknowing?
Together with other people who are willing to stay in there with me and not punish me for not knowing, right? We grew up, sometimes we grew up being punished for not knowing the answer in school, right? So who's around you who can stay in there with you as you not know together, as you unknow together, right? Who can stay in that place in a playful way with humor and even a sense of delight, like, hey, the stakes are really high. Let's have fun with not knowing. That sounds trite, radical, like it's not doing justice to the urgency of the moment, but I actually think it's the only thing that can do justice to the urgency of the moment, because otherwise we're not allowing ourselves to think broadly and deeply and radically creative ways about the kinds of questions we ask in our work in the Witness Institute are like, what's the relationship between dance and racial justice? The example I shared earlier. What's the relationship between poetry and human rights? What are we missing in our work as activists or leaders or community members when we leave out spiritual practice or myth or folklore or music? Yeah. And those kinds of questions emerge from, and we kind of iterate our program for our fellows where we are always adding sessions in those directions. We added a session on humor and moral leadership, humor and moral courage, because it wasn't something I had at all in my mind when we started, but it emerged from our conversations because we had a space that was very experimental, a laboratory, playful, serious and playful together. There's something about that is high caliber, high potential, and allows us, I think, to open up new kinds of questions and directions. We need new responses now. We cannot just keep using the same playbook to respond to these really high stakes moments. And so if we don't consider the role of, I don't know, children's cartoons in addressing our political crisis, or what, fill in the blank, like those kinds of out of the box juxtapositions, if we don't do that kind of work or that kind of play, we're in deep trouble because we end up with a limited palette. So the first step in that is supporting each other to hold that space, to have a vessel and a space for unknowing or not knowing, and the playfulness and exploration that comes, the wandering that comes with it.
Yes, Ariel, beautiful. And that, my friends, gets us to 2 minutes to 9 a.m. Thank you all for being with us at the Small Giants Academy. This is exactly the landscape we are trying to foster. And especially in Australia, I'm just going to get into advocacy mode for a second. Remember what Elie Wiesel said, superficiality is the enemy of everything. And I think in this country, having deep conversations, having deep questions, wanting to go to the depth and get beyond footy can be quite countercultural. And if you have the deeper questions, ask them and find collectives of people that want to have those juicy conversations. That's what the Small Giants Academy is for. We love you, grateful for everyone. Have a beautiful, beautiful day. And Rabbi Ariel Berger, thank you for being on our wisdom council of people we turn to when the stakes are really high. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you all so much. Many blessings.
Good morning or evening, friends. Here's your friendly announcer. I have serious news to pass on to everybody. What I'm about to say could mean the world's disaster, could change your joy and laughter to tears.